Alachua Sink Cave Incident. Alachua Sink is an underwater cave system in Florida that is very dangerous to dive in. In July 1992, two experienced divers came to explore this underwater cave. July is the worst time to dive because algae blooms make the water very murky. The algae turned the water green like paint and made it impossible to see. Smart divers know to never dive when algae blooms happen, but these two divers had driven a long way and didn't want to turn back. They decided to dive even though the water conditions were extremely dangerous. The divers entered the murky green water and started going down into the cave. Their lights could only shine a few inches through the thick algae. In underwater caves, divers must follow a guideline rope to stay safe. The guideline is like a trail that leads back to the surface. Without the guideline, divers can get lost and die in the underwater maze. Because they couldn't see well, the divers missed the main cave entrance. They accidentally went into a wrong passage that led nowhere. When they realized their mistake, they decided to turn around and go back. One diver was following behind his partner as they tried to exit the cave. The thick algae made it impossible to see each other even when close. The buddy could sometimes see his partner's light, but then it would disappear. As they swam back toward the entrance, something went terribly wrong. In the murky water, the two divers got separated without knowing it. The buddy couldn't see his partner's light anymore, but kept swimming out. He followed the guideline back to the surface like he was supposed to. When the buddy reached the surface, he expected to see his partner waiting, but his partner was nowhere to be found at the surface. The buddy called out but got no answer from his missing partner. Fear filled the buddy as he realized something was very wrong. He went back into the cave several times to search for his partner, but the thick algae made searching almost impossible. The buddy couldn't see anything in the green, murky water. After many failed search attempts, he called emergency rescue services. Professional rescue divers arrived quickly knowing time was running out. Even the experienced rescue team said it was the worst visibility they had ever seen. The rescue divers searched every tunnel and passage they could find. They even tried pumping fresh water into the cave to clear the algae, but the water was too thick with algae to improve visibility. For 3 long days, rescue teams searched the underwater cave system. Family members waited at the surface hoping for good news. On the 3rd day, the rescue team found the missing diver's body. He was deep in the cave system in a passage that was hard to find. Nickajack Cave Incident. On August 15, 1992, Gant and his friend went diving at Nickajack Cave in Tennessee. Nickajack Cave was underwater and protected by law because endangered bats lived there. A chain-link fence blocked the entrance to keep people out, but Gant and his friend wanted to find huge catfish that lived in the cave. Local fishermen told stories about catfish that were 6 to 8 feet long. The two divers were not trained for cave diving, but they entered illegally anyway. They swam under the fence and into the dark underwater cave. Cave diving is very dangerous because you can't swim straight up to escape. The water inside the cave was murky and cold. They swam deeper into the cave looking for the giant catfish. About 1,200 feet into the cave, Gant accidentally kicked the muddy bottom. A huge cloud of dirt and mud filled the water around them. The water became so murky they couldn't see anything at all. Gant tried to stay calm and wait for the dirt to settle, but his friend panicked and started moving around wildly. The friend's movements made the muddy water even worse. In all the confusion, the two divers got separated in the dark water. Gant's friend tried to find him, but couldn't see anything. The friend managed to swim back to the entrance and got out safely. He immediately called for help because Gant was lost inside the cave. Meanwhile, Gant was trapped alone in the underwater cave system. He was completely lost and running out of air to breathe. Every tunnel looked the same in the murky water. Gant didn't know which way led back to the entrance. His air gauge showed he was almost out of breathing air. Just when things looked hopeless, Gant found a small air pocket. The cave ceiling had a tiny space with air that was only 8 inches high. Gant grabbed onto a rock formation called a stalactite. He kept his head in the small airspace so he could breathe. His body stayed underwater, but his head was above the surface. Rescue teams knew they had to do something drastic to save Gant. The Tennessee Valley Authority decided to lower the water level of the entire lake. They opened the dam spillway to let water flow out. The lake dropped 3 feet, which created more airspace in the cave. As the water went down, Gant's tiny air pocket got bigger. He could move his head more and had more room to breathe. But Gant had been in the cold water for 16 hours by this time. He was very weak, cold, and sick from the long ordeal. Finally, rescue divers were able to reach Gant in the cave. They found him still holding onto the stalactite formation. Gant was weak and sick, but still alive after 16 hours. The rescuers helped him swim back to the cave entrance. When Gant came out of the cave, he needed medical help right away. His body temperature was dangerously low from the cold water. Ebenezer Cave Incident. On April 11, 1981, 3 friends went to explore Ebenezer Cave in Tennessee. John McReynolds was 16, Bon Funnel was 19, and Greg Rogers was 15. They only had 2 flashlights experts and were not experienced cave explorers. Only John had been in caves before, but he had never been to this cave. The three friends entered the cave and walked deeper underground. They climbed over rocks and squeezed through narrow spaces. They had to cross a dangerous narrow path over a deep pit. The path was slippery and muddy with few places to hold on. After exploring for 30 minutes, they decided to go back. They came back to the same dangerous path they had crossed before. This time they had to climb up instead of down. John went first with his flashlight to lead the way. After climbing 20 feet, John's foot slipped on the wet rocks. He lost his balance and fell into the darkness. His flashlight fell and spun around, sending light everywhere. John screamed as he fell 20 feet down into a pool of water. His friends watched in horror and couldn't help him. John splashed into the cold water and tried to swim. His arm was hurt from the fall and he couldn't swim well. Bon and Greg reached down trying to help but couldn't reach him. John got tired and started to sink under the water. The two friends shouted for help as loud as they could. Another group of cavers heard their calls for help. John Walker was leading the other group and rushed to help. John Walker dove into the water to search for John McReynolds. The water was dark and Walker could barely see anything. Walker found John's body underwater and pulled him to the side. John was not breathing and had passed out. The rescuers cleared water from John's mouth and gave him CPR. John coughed up water and started breathing again. He opened his eyes, but his words didn't make sense. John had a head injury and passed out again. Someone called the fire department for emergency help. Cave rescue experts came to help get John out. They put a harness on John to lift him up safely. It took until midnight to get John out of the cave. John was very cold and badly hurt. They rushed him to the hospital in an ambulance. John stayed in the hospital for many days. Doctors found he had serious head injuries and cuts all over his body. John eventually got better and made a full recovery. Gruta del Rio Chontalcuatlan Cave Incident. On March 9, 2003, a group of tourists went to Gruta del Rio Chontalcuatlan in Guerrero, Mexico. The group was poorly equipped visitors led by a local guide. The guide knew the cave passages but lacked safety training and equipment. The entrance to the cave was a steep canyon that dropped into darkness. The upper entrance required climbers to go down a dangerous slope of loose rock. Every step had to be carefully placed. Every handhold had to be tested before trusting it. Maria Santos was excited about the adventure ahead. She had come to Mexico for vacation, seeking thrills and experiences. Maria was partway down the entrance canyon. She carefully placed her feet on narrow ledges. She tested each handhold before putting her weight on it. The rock felt solid under her fingers. Above her, another tourist made a movement. A rock broke free from the formation above. The stone moved toward Maria like a bullet. It was just a few pounds of limestone that had been wedged in place for decades. The stone struck her in the head with a tremendous force. The impact was devastating. The blow to her head caused immediate trauma. It also made her lose her grip on the slope. Her hands released their hold on the rock face. Her feet lost their grip on the narrow ledges. In an instant, she went from being a controlled climber to a falling object. Maria's body struck the rocky slope repeatedly as she tumbled toward the darkness below. Each impact added new injuries to the massive head trauma. The other tourists watched in horror as Maria disappeared into the darkness. Then there was silence. The guide now faced every tour leader's worst nightmare. The group's first instinct was to climb down after her, but the guide stopped them. The guide immediately called rescuers. When rescuers finally reached Maria's body, they confirmed what everyone knew. The combination of the head trauma and the fall had been fatal. Maria had probably died instantly. The injuries were so severe that survival would have been impossible. The body recovery was a complex operation. The rescuers had to package the body carefully as they had to lift it up the dangerous slope without causing more rockfalls. The recovery took hours to complete. When Maria's body was finally brought to the surface, the full horror became clear. What had started as a fun tourist trip had ended in a preventable death. Arnold Hollow Cave Incident. On May 5, 1997, 4 explorers prepared to explore Arnold Hollow Cave. Dell Lancaster, her sister Diane, family friend Phyllis Nelson, and cave owner John Nelson entered the cave at 9 a.m. John had been excited about this trip for weeks. Deep inside his cave, about 400 yards from the entrance, was a tight passage. Beyond that narrow crawl, John believed there was a magnificent room that no human had ever seen. As they approached the tight spot, the passage narrowed until it became a crawl space. Dell went first, Diane followed, then Phyllis. Each woman worked her way through the tight space. John Nelson stood at the entrance to the crawl, studying the opening. John found the tight space particularly challenging because of his size. Today, he had a different plan. Instead of forcing himself through the narrow opening, John decided to make some changes. He wanted to enlarge the crawl space to make passage easier. John began working with his tools. He chipped away at the ceiling and hammered on some loose rocks. Each strike seemed to bring him closer to creating a more manageable passage. Then everything went wrong in an instant. The hammering had loosened more rock than John realized. The cave's delicate balance suddenly shifted. A deep rumble filled the air, followed by the sound of falling stone. Rocks tumbled down, filling the passage with debris and blocking the opening completely. The 3 women on the other side of the collapse found themselves trapped underground. One moment they were waiting in the larger room, and the next they had no way out. On the other side of the collapse, John Nelson stared at the blocked passage in horror. 3 people were trapped because of his actions. For the next hour, John worked frantically to clear the blockage, but the pile of rock remained unmoved. moved. The passage was completely sealed. Finally, John accepted that he couldn't handle this alone. He needed help fast. John made his way out of the cave as quickly as possible. The moment John emerged from the cave, he began making emergency calls. Local rescue services responded immediately. The rescue team examined the collapse area. They found that the collapse had created a small gap that allowed communication with the trapped women. The women trapped beyond the collapse were in a cramped space. Dell, Diane, and Phyllis were squeezed into a space barely large enough for 3 people. They had to remain pressed against each other. They couldn't sit or lie down comfortably. The rescue team decided not to clear the collapse until they had properly supported the passage. Moving rocks without proper support could cause the entire area to collapse further. Through the small gap in the debris, rescuers passed essential supplies to the women: food, water, and warm clothing. These supplies helped prevent hypothermia and maintain the women's strength. The mine workers joined the rescue team in installing proper support in the passage. The rescue team worked steadily. As evening approached, the rescue team felt confident enough to begin moving rocks. With the passage properly supported, they started clearing the collapse. As the clock approached 8:30 p.m., more than 11 hours after the collapse, the rescue team finally broke through. The passage was open again, creating a route to freedom. Dell, Diane, and Phyllis emerged from the cave in remarkably good spirits. Lava Tube Cave Incident. On April 24, 2001, Margaret Chen was walking with her 2 golden retriever puppies on the Big Island of Hawaii. The puppies were named Max and Luna and were 6 months old. Margaret had walked this path many times before. The area had lava tubes, underground tunnels formed by old lava flows. The puppies were playing and running around. As they reached the halfway point of their walk, the puppies suddenly ran away. There was no warning. One moment they were walking beside her, the next they were racing away. Margaret called after them, but they disappeared behind a ridge of volcanic rock. At first, Margaret wasn't worried because the puppies often wandered off for a few minutes. But as she followed their path and called their names, she couldn't find them. Minutes turned into an hour. Margaret's calling became more urgent. She climbed over rock formations she had never explored before. As darkness began to fall, real fear crept into her heart. She had only a small flashlight. Then she heard faint whimpering coming from below, somewhere beneath her feet. Margaret followed the sound, moving carefully across the uneven surface. The whimpering led her to a section with holes and pits. Margaret moved from hole to hole, calling down into the darkness. One hole was different. When she called into it, her voice echoed strangely. She aimed her flashlight down into the opening. About 15 feet down, she could see 2 small golden shapes huddled together on a ledge. Max and Luna were alive, but they were trapped. The lava tube opening was only about 2 feet wide, too narrow for Margaret to fit through. They were scared and unable to climb back up the smooth walls. Margaret's heart broke as she looked down at them. She called 911, but her cell phone had no signal. She tried lowering her belt down to them, but it wasn't long enough. Margaret refused to leave them. She lay on her stomach next to the opening, talking to them in soothing tones. Margaret made a decision that would cost her everything. She positioned herself over the opening, feet first, and began to lower herself down. The walls were smoother than they looked, and the opening was narrower than she estimated. Margaret slipped and fell headfirst into the lava tube. Margaret became wedged in the tube upside down. Her waist and upper body were pinned by the narrow walls. She was now close enough to touch her puppies, but she couldn't help them. She couldn't help herself. Hours passed, and Margaret's calls for help grew weaker. The next morning, a few hikers found them and called for help. Margaret was barely conscious. The rescue team arrived quickly. Her face was dark red from blood pooling in her head. She could barely speak. Being trapped upside down was slowly killing her. The blood pooling in her head was putting pressure on her brain and heart. Hours passed as they worked desperately to free her, but Margaret's body was shutting down. Margaret touched the puppies' noses one last time. She kept saying, "Take care of my dogs." The rescue workers never stopped trying, but Margaret's body couldn't survive being trapped upside down for so long. Margaret died trying to save her puppies. The rescue workers eventually retrieved her body and the 2 puppies.